Chapter 9, Part 2, Everlasting Family Feud. Ma'ale is the most stable place I have ever lived in. It is a settlement in the West Bank, a part of a collection of many settlements of a region called the Bikat Ayarden, the Valley of Jordan, established in 1978. At the time that I lived there were 1,400 people, but now it has grown to be 1,800. The settlement was called after the tribe of Ephraim and is surrounded by a razor wire fence for protection from the outsiders, mostly from malicious Arabs, and the entrance into the settlement is watchfully guarded. I've spent there most of my young childhood, both of kindergarten and elementary school. There, I was heavily taught how to be a patriot of my beloved country and the significance of my Jewish history reflected in my own Jewish identity. One of my earliest memories was when Grandma and I had to go to Jerusalem to see a specialist for my ongoing ear problems. There were no specialists in Ma'ale Ephraim, therefore we had to get on a bus whose windows were protected by a plastic grid from the Intifada, which is a word that means a group of people, mostly young lads and children, throwing piercing rocks and stones at a passing Israeli vehicle. The ride to Jerusalem was 40 minutes away, over very mountainous and meandering roads, crossing over many army bases. About 70% of the bus passengers were composed of armed soldiers going to different destinations. Thankfully, in 1995, the relations with the Palestinians had been tolerable then, nothing like they are today. For some reason, on the way back from Jerusalem, Grandma and I were stuck at night at a place called Tzomet Tapuach, which means apple crossroad. Either Grandma got off at the wrong stop or something went wrong. It was winter and it was cold. The rain was drizzling while the night crippled over us. Except for Grandma and I, there was not a soul to be seen. We were in the middle of a desert waiting for a bus, and for some reason there was no bus to be found. While Grandma was warming me inside her coat, a police jeep with 5 policemen on the road finally stopped for us. They didn't just invite us to come in, but they demanded us to get inside. The chief policeman looked at Grandma, saw an utter blank expression on her face, and turned to my 4-year-old self, saying, "Ma lechol harochot atem osim po? What in all the spirits are you doing here?" The expression in all the spirits is the same colloquial expression as hell. In other words, saying, "What in all the bad spirits are you doing here?" Now, bad spirits exist in the world, so I prefer that kind of expression instead of the English expression making me feel that I was dumped into the bottomless pit myself. The officer looked very angry and said it very scornfully that I almost started crying. I timidly told him in Hebrew that we were waiting for a bus, mechakim la'otobus. He intently looked at me and said, "Tell your grandma that she is a cuckoo. Tgidi lesavta shelach she cuckoo," while taking his index finger, placing it towards the temple of his head and twisting it. This time, I was very amused and thought that it would be easy to translate. So I said to Grandma, "Kira, полицай говорит, что ты cuckoo." Kira, the policeman says that you are a cuckoo, while mimicking the same hand gesture that the policeman showed me by fumbling the ridge of skin on my right temple and twisting my index finger on it. That is probably why I have that bridge. As soon as the wandering policeman in the car saw me making the gesture, the atmosphere significantly softened and they all laughed. Grandma laughed in embarrassment too. The problem is that the police officer had a legitimate concern. There could have been a chance that we bumped into a sniper. I don't know what their original destination had been, but they asked where we were headed, and they were familiar with Ma'ale Ephraim. As soon as we got to Ma'ale Ephraim, I became the navigator of the car. I was entrusted. I was promoted. Once we drove into the territory, I showed them with my index finger where to go, since I didn't know the distinction between left and right, which is still confused. Thank you very much. And they drove us straight to the house 404. If not straight into our beds. When we got off the Jeep car, I asked Grandma to get stuck in some tapuach again so I could tell her that she's a cuckoo. But Grandma learned her lesson and she took buses from Jerusalem that she knew for sure went straight to Ma'ale Ephraim. Grandma and I never hitchhiked. While Mom loved to hitchhike, it was her opportunity to meet men. If we were stuck in Summit Tapua right now this way and at that hour, we would have been torn into pieces. While I lived in Ma'ale Ephraim for myself, Grandma, and great-grandma, it was the most perfect location we could have ever chosen for ourselves. But Mother was very unsatisfied with it because for her age, there were no prospective opportunities there, and she thought the place was rather dull and unfit for her. Everybody knew everyone. She felt that there was much gossip going on, while I and my grandmas liked the togetherness and the sense of close community. For these reasons, however, Mom moved to live back with my father. Sometimes she would take me to visit my dad in Ashkelon. On the way of going to visit Dad, we traveled through Tel Aviv through a mall that has an enormous bus station. In Israel, usually malls are connected to bus stations going to all destinations across the cities of Israel. We stopped to eat at McDonald's and Mom had to pay for the meal, so she instructed me to sit and watch our stuff. I was distracted by all the appetizing images flashing across me, and I walked away from our suitcase. Forthwith, a brigade of guards came sizing up the suitcases and asking people to evacuate the facility for an unattended object that they were getting ready to explode in suspicion that there was a bomb inside. While I was sucked into my dazzling worldliness, my mom rushed towards the throng of people screaming, "Zesheli! That is mine!" The guards admonished her for not watching after it, and Mom said that she instructed me, her daughter, to watch it. "Who is your daughter?" the guards sternly asked. Mom pointed at me, and I waved my hand sheepishly as they looked at my miniature figure and laughed to themselves. After that, they understood that Mother was out of touch with what is rational and left the scene without any other word unspoken. In Israel, an unattended object is no jostle. While the United States acts upon the theory of the danger, Israel acts upon experience that has resulted in paranoia over the slightest suspicion of strangeness and disorderliness. When we finally came to Ashkelon, typically for a young and inquisitive child, one time I literally stared at the gas fire when the stove was on and was tempted to touch it. The snapping, flickering luminescence occupying the vacancy of space transfixed my gaze upon it. Its fleeing quality challenged me into grasping it and overpowering its agility. It behaves too much in control, and control I thought should be deprived of it by instilling my own human invincibility. That was observing me a small distance from me, reading my childish impulsivity of thought. "Don't touch it," he warned, but I naturally didn't learn until I acquainted myself with the pain of the consequences of my decisions by experiencing it through my skin. Tangible is my reality. Abstract threats fail to frighten me. The way Dad teaches me lessons are by self-experimentation, and you let me touch the flame and feel its sting. Since then, I have never played with fire ever again and succumbed to its control. Touching the untouchable, coming into contact with the most desirable yet detrimental in its nature is my fascination. Curiosity is my disguised enemy, yet it is my propeller. It is a shield of self-sustenance that in its scorching mutilation in consequence of its pursuit grants me the gift of premature wisdom that gives me the understanding of caution and gentility as I overstep through the field of coals and explosive mines of danger. In other words, even if it's an enemy, I face it and I try to figure out what is there to learn from it. Or even if it is a human being that is hostile towards me, I do not denounce him, yet I fight my battles on my own accord. I fight them in the name of love and not hate, but with that I keep in mind what it is I am fighting for, which allows me to pick my battles wisely. One thing that I am known to give much care for is the fight for the sake of sanity that is suffocated through imbibing nonsensical thoughts into other people who feel comfortable to subject the public into negativity instead of trying to filter out their minds. Another thing that I tirelessly fight for is letting people understand common sense. After learning that lesson of life, that fire is not to be touched, Mom and I went to a mall called Chutzot. I saw a colorful toy tape that one could press buttons on and it would start playing. I wanted Mom to buy it, and I was about to start throwing temper tantrums for her refusal, but Mom quietly told me to take it and get out of the store. My desire for the toy overpowered any morality that I was taught, and I unquestioningly and obediently stepped outside with it. The seller didn't even notice. Back then, there were no sensors and it was easy to steal. When we got out of this mall, I felt an intolerable sense of guilt rushing through my conscience. I understood full well the illegitimacy of our actions, and every time I looked at that tape, I was consumed with discomfort that, to this day, the sense of childish guilt is very well entrenched in my memory. Because of it, upon any of my temptations to steal, the uneasiness of that memory outweighs the benefit, which dissuades me from performing that act ever again. Unfortunately, though, Mom was very short-tempered at the time, as it seemed she wasn't happy and was on edge, and the fume of her heat would be transferred to me. There was one time that I wanted her attention and started crying, and Mom, in response, grabbed a towel and tried to stuff it in my mouth to muffle my cries. I was hurt and confused as to why I deserved such treatment, which further made me feel unwanted. Nevertheless, I learned to forgive, be softened at the thought of it, and move on. Around that age, 4, unlike in the United States in kindergarten, we were introduced to reading, and I picked it up at the speed of light. I was the fastest reader at 4. That dumbfounded other teachers around me. I quickly detected the point vowel rules in Hebrew, and they bragged to grandmother about my unusual successes. Saying that it was a rare sight that a child of a Russian-speaking family would progress with such a speed. Grandma, however, was uncomfortable by the way I was burring, which I think was natural because Hebrew's uvular R emits a very burring sound. But regardless, Grandma took me to a speech therapist, and it didn't hurt. There, Grandma and I were reading stories in Hebrew, and at the beginning we started off with me reading a word, and then Grandma a word, and then me reading a sentence, and then Grandma still stuck on reading a word. My mastery of the language of both Hebrew and Russian excelled, even though prior to Grandma's coming to Israel, I did not speak Russian at all. But Grandma wouldn't have it that her grandchild wouldn't speak her native tongue. At the same time, Grandma religiously read extensive books in Russian to me, such as Carlson on the Roof, Mary Poppins, and Pippi Longstocking. Right at 4, I was taught how to hold a pen right. If I didn't hold it right, I would be scorned as they hate my hand. Teachers did not play games with me. Nonetheless, my mother had custody over me, and she preferred that Grandma would take care of me. But my dad wanted the custody for himself and thought that if Mother didn't take care of me, it was not Grandma's job to take care of his child. He didn't like that he had to pay alimony when oftentimes he couldn't afford to pay it, and the government would pay for him instead. Thus, he developed debts over 50,000 shekels, which he owes to the government to this day. Because he can't pay off his debt, he can't get out of Israel even to visit other foreign countries. Throughout my childhood, he tried to brainwash me to convince Mom to take off the alimony. Mom refused. He badmouthed my mother's family, and my mother's family would badmouth him. I just wanted to love them both. Dad would always tell me, if I had you, I would shower you with gold, or I would take off my underwear for you. However, not only did he not win custody over me, there was a constant fight between my grandma and him to give me up to to him during the holidays. Grandma's usual discipline was to beat me up upon the slightest insolence, and as a result, I had bruises. Dad made social workers examine me and was tirelessly hiring lawyers to win custody. But upon their questioning, I gave positive accounts of Grandma and my continual missing of Mom, and he lost the cases. Grandma's rage of Dad was non-stop. One day he wanted to take me on a holiday and Grandma refused. All of me wanted to be with my dad, but Grandma's friend Vala, who later on turned out to be my piano teacher, held me in my resistance. I finally broke loose and ran the road towards Dad, and we went to the police to straighten out the matter. I just remember my tears rushing upon my cheek and Dad holding me in his arms while I recited the number of our home phone. The family feud didn't end there. When I once talked to my grandma, I asked, "Grandma, what do you have against my father?" Grandma replied, "When you grow up, you will understand."